Have you ever wondered why the person who acted like they needed space suddenly seems the most affected when you finally give it to them? Because what looks like silence on the outside is often chaos on the inside. And if you stay with this until the end, you will understand something most people never do. You will understand what your silence is really doing to an avoidant mind, and why no contact is not just distance. It is pressure. It is truth. It is the mirror they never wanted to face. Most people think when an avoidant pulls away, it means they do not care. They assume distance means disinterest. Coldness means closure. Silence means peace. But human psychology is never that simple, especially not with someone who has trained themselves to survive through emotional withdrawal. Avoidants do not always run because they feel nothing. Sometimes they run because they feel too much. That is the part most people miss. They have spent years learning how to disconnect before they get too attached, how to create emotional space before vulnerability gets too close, how to stay just far enough away to avoid feeling dependent, exposed, or emotionally trapped. And for a while, this works for them. It protects them. It gives them control. Until one day, you stop chasing. You stop asking. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who keeps acting unsure. And that is when everything changes. Because an avoidant can handle your emotions when they think they can predict them. They can handle your love when they believe they can keep it at a distance. They can handle your presence when they assume you will always stay available. But your absence? That is different. Your absence removes the one thing they quietly relied on, your emotional availability, and that is where the silence begins to speak louder than words ever could. See, when you are always there, they never have to fully feel the possibility of losing you. Your texts, your patience, your understanding, your constant return, all of it becomes a psychological cushion, even if they never say it, even if they act detached, even if they keep one foot out the door. They get used to your presence as a safety net, not because they know how to cherish it, but because they assume it will not disappear, and human beings rarely value what feels guaranteed. That is not cruelty. That is psychology. The mind does not wake up when something is available on demand. It wakes up when access is removed. That is why no contact hits differently, because for the first time, they cannot control the emotional distance anymore. Before, they were the ones deciding when to respond, when to open up, when to pull back, when to give just enough to keep the connection alive without fully stepping into it. They held the power by keeping things uncertain. But when you go no contact, the power shifts. Now they are the one who does not know. Now they are the one sitting in uncertainty. Now they are the one wondering if the door they kept half open has finally closed. And that uncertainty begins to do something powerful inside them. It creates emotional awareness. Not because they suddenly become a different person overnight. Not because silence magically transforms them into someone emotionally available. But because your absence interrupts their pattern. And once a pattern is interrupted, the mind notices. That is when they begin to feel something they are not used to naming. Not always heartbreak, not always immediate regret, but disruption, a strange emotional discomfort, a quiet internal shift, a growing awareness that something familiar is gone. And this is where it gets deeper. Because avoidants often do not respond to loss in obvious ways. They do not always cry, confess, or collapse. Their pain does not always look emotional. Sometimes it looks like more distance, more distraction, more pretending, more busyness, more silence. But silence does not mean they are unaffected. It often means they are trying to stay in control of what they are starting to feel. And what they are starting to feel is this: you were supposed to still be there. That thought can shake them more than they will ever admit. Because deep down, many avoidants build relationships around an invisible assumption. They may not say it. They may not even consciously realize it. But it lives underneath their behavior. They believe love will wait for them while they stay emotionally unavailable. They believe connection will survive, even if they never fully show up. They believe people will bend, stay patient, and keep understanding them forever. So when you disappear, you are not just creating distance. You are breaking the illusion. You are showing them that access to you was never permanent, and that realization creates tension. Because now, for the first time, they are forced to sit in a reality they never prepared for. The reality that someone they kept at arm's length may actually be gone. And this is where human psychology becomes brutal, because people often do not feel the full emotional weight of someone's value while that person is still trying to be understood. They feel it when the effort disappears, when the energy goes quiet, when the emotional supply is cut off. That is when the nervous system notices the loss. That is when memory starts to become louder. That is when the mind begins replaying things it ignored before. Your warmth, your consistency, your presence, your patience, all the things they once treated like background comfort, begin to rise into focus. Because what was once constant is now missing. And absence has a way of revealing importance. This is why your silence is not weakness. It is not manipulation. It is not a game. When done with self-respect, no contact becomes one of the clearest psychological messages a person can send. It says, you do not get unlimited access to me while giving me half of yourself. It says, my presence is not something you get to take for granted. It says, if you want connection, you have to feel the cost of losing it. And whether they admit it or not, they do feel that cost. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the dramatic way people expect, but internally, something starts moving. Something starts waking up, because your silence does what your words could not. It removes the comfort of your constant availability. And once that comfort is gone, they are left with something they have spent years trying to avoid: the truth of what your absence means. Not your begging, not your pain, not your explanations, just your absence. And absence is powerful because it cannot be argued with. It cannot be debated. It cannot be emotionally managed. It simply exists. And in that silence, they begin to hear everything they were able to ignore when you were still there. That is where the shift begins. Not in the message they send, not in the reaction they show, but in the quiet moment when they realize you are no longer chasing. And suddenly, the person who once felt emotionally too much to deal with becomes the one they cannot stop noticing. That is when the silence starts doing its work, and that is only the beginning. What makes this so confusing is that the moment you finally step away, the battle inside them often gets louder, not quieter. From the outside, they may still look calm, still distant, still unaffected, but inside, something uncomfortable begins to build. Because now there is no distraction coming from you, no emotional pursuit, no reassurance, no check-ins, no attempts to pull closeness out of someone who kept resisting it. And once that outside pressure disappears, they are left alone with something they have spent most of their life trying to outrun: their own emotional reality. This is where the inner conflict begins. And for an avoidant, inner conflict is not a small thing. It is exhausting, because part of them still wants freedom, still wants emotional space, still wants relief from intensity, expectations, vulnerability, and the pressure of being deeply needed. That part of them tells them this distance is good, necessary, easier. It whispers, this is better, this is what you wanted. But another part of them, the part they usually keep buried, starts reacting in a completely different way. That part notices the emptiness. That part notices the change in energy. That part feels the missing emotional bond, even if they do not know how to describe it. And now both sides are alive at the same time. One side says, stay detached. The other side quietly asks, then why does this feel so strange? That question is where their control begins to crack, because avoidants often survive through emotional suppression, not emotional understanding. They become skilled at numbing, minimizing, intellectualizing, and distancing themselves from what they actually feel. Not because they are evil, not because they enjoy hurting people, but because somewhere in their past, closeness stopped feeling safe. For many of them, intimacy became linked to discomfort, need became weakness, dependence became danger, and over time, they built a nervous system that learned one thing very well: do not feel too much, do not need too much, do not let anyone get too close. So when a real bond forms, it creates tension inside them, not because they do not care, but because care itself starts activating fear. And this is why no contact affects them in such a complicated way. It does not just make them miss you. It activates the exact emotional contradictions they never learned how to handle. Because suddenly, they are not just dealing with your absence, they are dealing with themselves. And that is where the discomfort becomes powerful. At first, many avoidants try to manage it mentally. They explain it away. They tell themselves they are fine. They focus on work. They stay busy. They scroll. They distract themselves. They keep moving because movement protects them from emotional stillness. But the human mind is not a machine. It remembers what mattered, even if the heart tries to deny it. And that is why your absence starts showing up in places they did not expect, not always in dramatic waves, sometimes in tiny moments. A song they did not think would hit them, a familiar phrase, a random memory, a silence at the end of the day that feels heavier than usual. These moments catch them off guard because they are not prepared for emotional echoes. They thought distance would bring relief. They thought time would make things simpler. But instead, the space begins to fill with reminders. And the hardest part for them is this: they cannot fully run from what is now happening internally. Because when someone goes no contact, the avoidant loses access not only to the person, but also to the emotional pattern that kept them comfortable. Before, they could keep you close enough to feel secure and far enough to avoid real accountability. That middle zone protected them. It allowed them to feel connected without fully surrendering. It gave them the illusion that they could keep love nearby without truly stepping into it. But now that middle zone is gone, and without it, they start to feel emotionally exposed. That exposure can create anxiety they do not even know how to name. Not because they suddenly become openly expressive, but because the mind starts asking dangerous questions. What if they're really done? What if I push too far? What if I lose someone who actually mattered? These are not easy thoughts for an avoidant to sit with, because those questions threaten the identity they built around being independent, unaffected, and emotionally self-contained. They want to believe they do not need much. They want to believe they are okay on their own. They want to believe nothing truly touches them deeply enough to shake them. But your silence challenges that story. And once that story is challenged, something begins to happen that many people never see. They start feeling the pull. That pull is not always love in the romantic movie sense. Sometimes it is attachment, waking up after being buried under layers of defense. Sometimes it is the nervous system realizing a familiar bond is no longer available. Sometimes it is the mind trying to reconnect with something it once took for granted. And that pull creates tension because it goes against everything they usually trust inside themselves. They are used to backing away when emotions rise. But now emotion is rising in the absence of contact, which means they cannot blame the closeness anymore. They cannot say, I just need space, because now they have space, and they still do not feel settled. That is what makes this stage so psychologically intense. They got what they thought they wanted, and yet something still feels unresolved. That unresolved feeling can stay with them longer than they expected. It can sit underneath their routines, underneath their distractions, underneath the image they try to present to the world. And often they do not tell anyone, because avoidants are not always comfortable speaking from emotional exposure. Many of them would rather appear unaffected than admit they are internally struggling. So instead of expressing what they feel, they carry it in silence. But silent conflict is still conflict, and the body always keeps score. The tension starts showing up in restlessness, irritability, mental replay, emotional numbness mixed with sudden flashes of feeling. One part of them wants to move on quickly. Another part keeps circling back to what they lost access to. That loop can become exhausting because now they are not just missing a person. They are confronting a truth that your absence is touching something deeper than pride. It is touching attachment. It is touching vulnerability. It is touching the part of them that wanted connection but never learned how to hold it properly. And this is where many people make the mistake of thinking if they cared, they would immediately show it. But psychology does not work that way. People do not always respond to pain with honesty. Sometimes they respond with resistance. Sometimes they respond with withdrawal. Sometimes they respond by trying even harder to act like none of it matters. But acting detached and being unaffected are not the same thing. A person can stay silent and still feel torn apart inside. A person can avoid reaching out and still feel the weight of what they lost. A person can look composed and still be fighting a private emotional war. And that is exactly what begins happening here, because your silence has forced them into the one place they never wanted to stay long enough to understand, their own heart. And when that private emotional war goes on long enough, a hidden hope begins to rise inside them, one they would almost never admit out loud. They start hoping you will break first. Not always because they want to hurt you, not always because they are cold, but because your return would rescue them from having to face what your absence is teaching them. That is the part people rarely understand. When someone with avoidant patterns loses access to a person who once kept showing up, their first instinct is not always growth. It is often relief mixed with resistance, then confusion, then a quiet wish that everything could return to the old emotional arrangement without them having to truly change. And that old arrangement had one very specific structure. You cared more openly, you stayed longer, you carried the emotional weight, you kept reaching, you kept trying to understand what they never clearly explained. That dynamic protected them. It allowed them to stay guarded while still receiving closeness. It allowed them to hold connection without fully stepping into emotional responsibility. It gave them the comfort of being wanted without the pressure of fully opening their inner world. So when you go silent and stay silent, they are not only losing a person, they are losing a system that worked in their favor, and deep down, they want that system back. That is why one of the strongest things an avoidant secretly hopes for during no contact is simple: that you reach out first, that you send the text, that you reopen the door, that you prove once again that no matter how distant they became, your attachment to them remains stronger than your self-respect. Because if you do that, something very important happens inside them. They can relax, not because the relationship is healed, not because they suddenly understand your value in a healthy way, but because your return confirms a belief they have been unconsciously relying on for a long time. The connection is still there whenever I want it. And once that belief is confirmed, they do not have to feel the full consequences of losing you. That is why staying gone matters so much. Because if you come back too early, you interrupt the very psychological process that was finally beginning to affect them. You remove the discomfort before it has time to become awareness. You erase the uncertainty before it has time to challenge their emotional habits. You soothe the wound they needed to actually feel. And when that happens, the lesson is lost. The old pattern survives. They learn that distance has no real cost, that your silence is temporary, that your absence is only a pause, that no matter what they avoid, they never truly have to lose anything. And once a person believes that, they have no reason to confront themselves. That is why no contact only becomes powerful when it is real. Not performative, not a strategy to create panic, not a countdown until they finally notice you, but a genuine decision to stop giving your energy where it is not being handled with care. Because once your silence becomes real to them, something starts shifting beneath the surface. At first, they still hold on to the assumption that you will return. They tell themselves, this is temporary. They expect you to crack. They imagine your emotions will pull you back the way they always have before. In their mind, there is still time, still access, still room for them to remain passive while the bond somehow stays alive. But when the days keep passing, when your presence does not come back, when the phone stays quiet, when your energy is no longer circling around them, that assumption begins to weaken. And once that assumption weakens, something far more uncomfortable begins to enter. Doubt. Not always the loud kind, not always dramatic. Sometimes it arrives in a very quiet way. A subtle inner question, a feeling they cannot fully shake, a shift in certainty. Because now, for the first time, they are not fully sure where they stand with you. And uncertainty is deeply unsettling for someone who once relied on emotional distance to feel in control. That is what makes this stage so important. The moment they are no longer certain of your availability is often the moment your value becomes emotionally real to them. Before, they could keep you in the background of their life like an option they never had to lose. Now, they begin sensing that you may actually be moving beyond their reach, and human psychology reacts strongly to that, because people often do not confront the importance of something while it still feels accessible. They confront it when they feel the possibility of permanent loss. That is when the mind starts shifting from comfort to concern. And once concern enters the picture, they begin looking at everything differently. They start revisiting your place in their life. They start measuring what your absence has changed. They start feeling the emotional consequences of what they once dismissed. And one of the hardest things for them to process is this: you are no longer emotionally orbiting around them. That changes the entire structure. Because as long as your focus remained on them, they still had psychological leverage. They could stay inactive and still feel your energy. They could remain withdrawn and still sense your attachment. Even if they gave very little, Your presence kept feeding the connection. But now, your energy is no longer available to regulate their ego, and that can hit deeper than they expected. Because beneath the distance, many avoidants still want to feel significant. They still want to believe they matter to you. They still want to believe they could come back and find the same emotional access waiting. Not always because they are ready for healthy love, but because being deeply wanted gives them a sense of security they do not know how to create for themselves. So when your silence remains consistent, it does something psychologically sharp. It forces them to question whether they still hold the same place in your heart. And that question can quietly shake them. Because now they are not just dealing with your absence, they are dealing with the possibility that they are no longer central in your emotional world. That possibility can trigger something many avoidants dislike more than vulnerability itself: loss of control. Before, they could control the pace, the distance, the access, the emotional rhythm of the connection. They could keep things undefined and still benefit from your loyalty. But now they cannot predict you. They cannot manage your reactions. They cannot count on your emotional availability the way they once did. And once predictability disappears, the emotional walls that kept them comfortable begin to tremble. This is where a lot of internal pressure builds, because part of them still wants to stay hidden, still wants to avoid exposure, still wants to protect themselves by doing nothing, but another part begins to feel the cost of that silence. And that cost gets heavier over time, not just because they miss you, but because your silence is now forcing them to face a truth they spent a long time escaping, that someone can love them deeply and still walk away. That realization can be one of the most life-altering experiences for an avoidant mind, because it destroys the fantasy that love will always wait while they remain emotionally absent. It breaks the illusion that closeness can be postponed forever without consequence. It reveals that real connection is not sustained by assumption. It is sustained by presence, effort, honesty, and emotional courage. And when they start realizing they may have lost someone who offered all of that, the walls inside them do not collapse all at once, but they do begin to crack. And once those cracks begin to form, there comes a moment they fear more than anything else. The moment it finally feels real. Not dramatic, not loud, not always visible from the outside, but deeply real. This is the point where the mind can no longer protect them with delay, denial, or emotional escape. This is where they begin to understand that what they lost may not be paused. It may be over. And that realization lands differently than most people expect, because when someone has lived behind emotional walls for a long time, they often do not collapse the moment a connection ends. Their nervous system is trained to stay defended, to stay controlled, to stay hidden. So instead of immediate emotional release, what often happens is something slower and heavier. The truth starts sinking in piece by piece. A quiet recognition, a growing ache, a feeling that keeps returning even when they try to bury it. This is the stage where the absence stops feeling temporary and starts feeling permanent. And that is when the emotional weight becomes impossible to fully outrun. Because as long as part of them believed you might come back, they could stay psychologically protected. They could keep a part of the bond alive in their mind. They could delay the deeper grief by telling themselves the door was still open, that nothing had truly ended, that they still had time. But once that belief begins to die, they are left standing in a reality they do not know how to control. You kept your distance. You did not fold. You did not come back to restore the old pattern. And now they are forced to sit with something that avoidant people often fear more than rejection itself: irreversible loss. That is what hits them. Not just the missing conversations, not just the vanished routine, but the understanding that someone who once cared deeply enough to stay through confusion, mixed signals, emotional inconsistency, and distance finally chose themselves. That can be a brutal thing for them to absorb, because it does not only create sadness, it creates reflection. And reflection is dangerous for someone who has spent years surviving by not looking too closely at their own emotional behavior. This is where regret often begins to rise, not always in a clean, mature, easy-to-express form. Sometimes it comes as restlessness. Sometimes it comes as a heavy silence they cannot explain. Sometimes it comes as mental replay. Moments they ignored now return with more meaning. Things they brushed past now feel different. The care you gave, the patience you carried, the understanding you offered, the emotional doors you kept opening. What once felt ordinary now starts looking rare, and once something rare is gone, the mind begins to reevaluate everything. That is one of the cruelest truths of human nature. People often understand value most clearly after they no longer have access to it. And that delayed awareness can be painful, because by the time they begin to truly feel what your presence meant, they may also begin sensing that they no longer have the right to reach for it in the same way. That is where shame can enter, not always spoken, not always fully conscious, but present. Because now it is not only about missing you, it is also about confronting what they did not give while they still had the chance. That is a hard emotional mirror to face, especially for someone who built their identity around emotional distance, self-protection, and staying one step removed from vulnerability. Because now they are left with a painful question: what if I only understood their importance after it was too late? That question can stay with them for a long time.